I think it would be great if you could just introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and then I'll jump into the questions I prepared.
Okay, sounds great. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. I'm Liam Corley. I'm a professor of American literature at California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. I'm also a U.S. Navy Reserve officer, and I come to the Journal of Veteran Studies after kind of a long history of working in the dark on veterans-related issues and not even realizing it as I was going through the 19th century American depictions of veterans. And then sort of after a deployment to Afghanistan and more recently a deployment from Iraq that I just returned from, I began to understand a lot more the prevalence of veterancy really in American culture. And so I've appreciated being associated with Journal of Veteran Studies really from the get-go when it was founded.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about your 2017 article from the Journal of Veteran Studies. My understanding, this paper was published as an adaptation from a conference presentation that you gave in 2015 at the Conference on College Composition and Communication. In your presentation and your paper, you identified what you call the veteran trope, and argue that it constrains veterans' writings. And then to substantiate the claim, you relied on examples from Homer's Odyssey and the writing of veteran and author Phil Cly. So I guess to begin, maybe you'll tell us the title of the article, and then you'll also begin by defining or describing this veteran trope that you have seen.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you throw a lot of syllables at a title, it sounds smarter. So epistemological interference in the trope of the veteran. I was trying to really kind of condense the two key ideas in the article into the title. But epistemology is just how we know what we know. And sometimes the things we know get in the way with communicating with a particular audience. We might feel like, oh, I only know things in this way. They're not going to want to hear that. Or we try to make an argument about, why something is a better investment. Only our evidence is based on something that is not relevant to investments. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about epistemological interference in the title. And the trope of the veteran really is the source of that interference, because veterans are supposed to know things. In American society, particularly, over the last couple hundred years, the popular understanding of what a veteran is has contained inside of it certain types of knowing that veterans are expected to have. And those are, they don't hold up to a lot of scrutiny. They are culturally created, and they may or may not match up at all with any individual veteran's experiences. And that creates a level of interference as well between people being ascribed a role that doesn't feel comfortable to them, to then use knowledge that's ascribed to them that doesn't feel organic to them. Yeah, I think we can go from there, but that gets us on the playing field.
Excellent. That's really helpful. And in your answer, you broke down the title very helpfully, which was my next question. And you kind of mentioned this in your introduction, but I guess I'm curious about, how the argument you made in this paper was inspired by, your experience as an active member of the military, and you talked a little bit about, some deployments, but can you tell us a little bit more about your service and also how it may have influenced your writing of this, as writing of this and then writing writ large, because you are a published author in many venues.
I appreciate that. Yeah. I think the context, which you said at the beginning, of this was a paper given at 4Cs, which is a community of rhetors and scholars coming together. I mean, that working group was really focused on how do we serve veterans in the university, especially in the writing classroom. And at the time of that session, I was really on a journey. After I came back from my first deployment to Afghanistan, I really struggled to re-enter academic discourse. My writing that I do in the military is really high stakes. A lot of analysis. It doesn't circulate openly, but it certainly circulates more broadly than most of my academic work. So it gets a lot more read, a lot more scrutinized, has a lot more effects in the world. But when I came back to academic writing, I think I really did struggle to hit the right tone. So partly that caused me to turn to poetry. Also, it made me turn to fiction, which I can talk about at a different point in this interview, maybe. But it gave me a sense of some of the key ideas in this essay, which is that when I would meet with people and they'd say, "Hey, how was it?" Or, what do you think about, Afghanistan? Wow. And these are questions that go way beyond what a service member who's been deployed to a location like that knows anything about. Now, I'm in a particularly privileged position. I got to look at geopolitics. Most of my job really was considering big picture. But even then, I just had a piece of the pie. And I was probably even more sensitive to the fact that there's a lot more I didn't know than I knew. And the types of questions people were asking because they wanted to know, are we doing good stuff over there? Right. And I'm like, well, that's a political question. And what I experienced on deployment isn't the type of evidence that can really address the civic questions that came at me. But I think there's kind of a history inside of American literature where and American culture, really, where veterans are supposed to be some kind of stewards of the state, to have an investment, obviously, right? If you're willing to risk your life or perhaps even deliver it up, there is a high investment in the state, and that's often been reciprocated with influence inside the state. But what that experience of being a veteran is, it's not just commitment. A host of other things have been associated with it. Unfortunately, now most of the things associated with it really have very little relevance for policymaking or any of the kind of political decisions about the use of force as a country. And I think that's the bind I would feel. I mean, I was a little smarter when I came back from Iraq. This last tour, in terms of not jumping into conversations. But I mean, I struggled with silence after Afghanistan, and this time I had a better, set phrases, and I could contextualize more because I had done a lot of study on my own, including, this article, to sort of articulate the challenges, the barriers between what I did know through experience and what I knew through study, which are two very different things.
Yeah, interesting. Good. You talked a little bit about seeing the shift of maybe how the trope of the veteran has changed. And my question is, it's been 8 years since this article has been published. Are there more explicit things? Although, again, I feel like you've detailed some of these answers a little bit, but would you elaborate or share some other ideas of how has this idea of the veteran trope aged in the last 8 years, since you first developed and shared this argument, and Have you
Yeah,
noticed anything maybe? And do you think the argument still holds up? I'm hearing that you think it does in many ways, but just yeah.
I still find it compelling. But there is a different position of the veteran in American society right now. One of the things about the 19th century construction of veterans in American literature is that post-Civil War, the main thing the veteran knows is suffering, right? Pain, and that the chain of command cannot be trusted. I think, so a little bit of bitterness, right? If you were to sort of say, oh, what would you expect, a veteran to be? Well, someone who's probably been ill-served by their chain of command, or at least didn't understand what they were doing. And familiar with all sorts of other pains and such like that. The ideal veteran, as it were, in 19th century American literature was unable to express what their veteran experience meant. There's a lot of key figures who just were inarticulate, had an ineffable knowledge, we could say. Much like, a religious enthusiast, isn't going to like argue somebody into religious belief. They have it through revelation, and there's actually a fair amount of common ground. An article about combat Gnosticism, which I refer to in my article, goes through that as well. But I think the early stages of the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, there was a lot of deference to veterans. I think there was a key moment even with the way presidents used policymaking and military influence on that. I think of the surge, that was, authored largely under the Obama administration by General David Petraeus. There was a sense that, oh, military experts, they know some stuff, they can figure this stuff out, and that whenever it was made political whether or not we should be doing this, it was like, oh, no, we need to defer to this other type of authority. And it took military decision making out of the public sphere. It really damaged the civil military relationship in which military force is to be used according to the values and guidance of civilian authorities, which don't have the constraints or the insights that might come from direct experience of conflict. So I think when I first started writing, there was a lot of people interested, thank you for your service, asking questions. There was a lot of understanding that in order to welcome the warrior back, the community needs, to hear their stories. It's something I talk about in this. Now, although I think there's still a broad section of American society that would, hold with that, and I think no changes are absolute. There have been a lot of veterans who've run for office from all different political spectrums and backgrounds in the last 10 years. And that sort of breaks the basic contract, which is, all right, you have special knowledge, special insight, but don't be troublesome. Don't get involved in the political scene, because ultimately, what do you know? Grunt or things of those nature that sort of get back in your lane. And so I think veterans who've experienced political life to all across the spectrum recognize really the constraints that I'm talking about in terms of the trope of the veteran affects the type of authority their statements are given when they stray out of what veterans are expected to know about or care about.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, I'm going to jump now. If you could talk a little bit about maybe your favorite part of the article, if there is a favorite part that you might have, and maybe why you thought that was a particularly strong or compelling part of your article.
Yeah, that I took some time this morning to reread the article, to highlight a few sections, and honestly, I still feel like the classical moments that I started the piece with really capture my heart and my imagination, and particularly the section where I'm talking about Odysseus, when it's really early on, when he's been received by the Phaeacians, listening to a bard singing war stories really about him and his comrades, and so he's just really grieving. He's weeping, and so the section that when I reread today, I'm like, yeah, definitely. Because Odysseus signals his strong emotional connection to the warriors praised by the bard. And Homer's arresting image of a grieving widow evokes Hector's Andromache more than it does Odysseus's Penelope. And it suggestively expands the scope of Odysseus's empathetic sorrow to include all those lost in the siege of Troy, Greek and Trojan alike. This Odysseus grieves for what he has done as much as for whom he has lost. The essay continues with one more sentence that I think gives you that sort of double bind that veteran writers and thinkers might fall into. The range of his emotional responsiveness to include comrade, to include those who were cast as enemies, complicates an ethnocentric audience's ability to hear his expansive grief, a further spur towards careful self-disclosure. Moral ambiguity or moral injury is a really hard thing to bring up in casual conversation with people, especially when it relates to the lack of critical engagement of the American public and how we use our military force overseas. These are questions that are outsourced to foreign policy experts and veterans in a way. But it's democratic society, and our elections determine what our foreign policy are going to be. And so I think it's really tricky. And that section where Odysseus is grieving for what he's done, as well as who he's lost, and is recognizing that how he talks about that loss and grief could be really complicated given his audience.
Awesome. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, obviously, in just the article itself, but here in hearing you talk through it a bit more. But I don't know, is there any final lasting ideas or thoughts you would like us to think about, consider, or know? Maybe, is there anything else you want us to know about the writing process or anything else when reading your article?
I think the article ends really kind of optimistically, which I have a tendency towards when I'm writing. Like I don't feel that way during the day, but when I sit down to write, I feel sort of compelled to be hopeful. And I do think that the farther we get into the aftermath of our Iraq and Afghanistan wars, just like as happened with Vietnam and with other great conflicts, more reflection, more insight, more art, results from that conflict. And part of that is what I talk about. That I really think, Phil Clay and others really are exemplifying. There was an article in the LA Times recently reviewing a new book by Kevin Powers. And it basically said, yeah, all these novelists, veteran novelist writers came out, in the early, years of this war. They wrote a few books and now we don't really care anymore. That's really what it came down to. They have, a way of talking about veteran experience that is not deemed as relevant by a lot of readers. And I think that really concerned me when I wrote this article, because the trope of the veteran really limits artistic interest in veteran creations as well. And the way I describe it towards the end of the article is that, contemporary war literature might be described more as like solipsistic battle literature or soldier literature, rather than something that gives readers insight into the motivations and justifications for national policies leading to a specific war. And so I think, that's the kind of thing that, as we consider new wars, I think there's a lot to gain from carefully reading the works of people who've tried to explain our last ones. Yeah. So I'll leave you with that, I guess.
Yeah, that's very well said. I agree. You talked about fiction and poetry, as well as being genres that you work in, and share your ideas with. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you're currently working on, whether it be related to this topic or not. You tell us, and also where we might find some of that work that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, this is the fun stuff. Well, okay, so obviously as a scholar of American literature, especially someone who's, taken a lot of interest in fiction by veteran writers, the question I had was like, well, am I going to write about my experiences or not? Am I going to incorporate those into fiction? And I was extremely gun shy for all of these reasons laid out in the article about writing anything set in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the contemporary United States. Maybe I was just doing a number on myself, but like, if you look at the amount of time that like Roy Scranton or Phil Clay have dedicated to advanced academic study in order to inform the positions, that they take on American foreign policy and the use of force. Obviously Phil's a bit more of the moral voice in that, brings strong influence from his Catholic heritage and study as well. But for me, I was like, that would put fiction writing into the same high stakes environment that my scholarly writing, exists in. And, reader number 2, or someone who's going to say, that's not how we did it in Kabul. Or, no, actually, that person wasn't appointed commanding general until after this scandal, which was, I didn't want to play to that. It wasn't a healthy place for me. It didn't sound like fun. But there's this tremendous heritage of veterans writing science fiction, right? Incredible writers, Robert Heinlein, Larry Heinman, I'm looking at his book right now, Kurt Vonnegut, Pity the Reader, Slaughterhouse-Five. So many great science fiction writers did have that. Joe Haldeman, that's who I was thinking of earlier, the Forever Wars. They were free, really, to speak more freely about veteran-related issues by sort of shifting into a non-controversial alternate Earth, alternate history, or aliens, all sorts of ways in which they could, be both more blunt but also more creative in their engagement with these issues. So that's what I decided to do ultimately. First, I sort of re-entered writing with poetry, which I have an article in college English on that, which really describes why poetry worked better for me in rediscovering confidence in my voice. But science fiction really gave me a lot more of that expansive pleasure of critiquing and understanding even myself as a character with more compassion and understanding than I think I could do in another genre. So yeah, I actually have 2 books coming out in the next few months. It's an embarrassment of riches that sort of tells you, like, what I think is a proverb in the Bible is like, cast your bread upon the water and it'll come back to you after many days. Well, before I deployed to Iraq this last time, I cast a lot of bread on the water, and during my deployment, I received publishing contracts for both a collection of poetry coming out from Middle West Press, actually in just a few weeks, August 8th. That's currently only available for pre-order on Kindle, but as soon as August 8th hits, it'll be print on demand and people can get paper copies. And certainly look at the acknowledgement sections in both of these books, because oh my, I think you might recognize a name or two in there, because they really are part of my veteran journey and experience. The poetry book is Unwound, Poems from Enduring War. Middle West Press is bringing that out. Great writers. So on one hand, I'm like shifting from scholar now to maybe subject of scholarship. I don't know. Hopefully at least a reader ship that has some scholars I've known over the years in it. So the science fiction novel is Changelings Insurgents. And that's an interesting story. That's coming out from Millspeak Books, which is a very, friendly to military writers press. That's kind of their reason for being. That comes out in November. Also, though, the print and ebook versions are already up on any sort of distributors you want to look at, so you can get a little bit of that flavor of it if you want to. So that is coming out in November, and that really includes a lot of what I've learned as a father, as a husband, military spouses going through deployment. Those aren't the kinds of details you usually get. Usually it's a hero's journey story, right? It's the individual, or you might get a home front exclusive focus, where it really is about the people who are left behind. And so anyhow, I think I have two parts to the science fiction book. I'm working on the sequel now. So we'll see where that goes. It is certainly gotten in the way of some of my scholarly projects, we'll say. I'm still working on the voice of the veteran in 18th and 19th century American literature. But I expect all things will have their season. And this is the season for science fiction and poetry.
That's so exciting. Holy cow. I'm really excited for you and for us to be able to read this stuff, really. And I'm really particularly amped on the idea, like you're saying, of the science fiction book talking about, it sounds like, again, from multiple angles. I love that the home front and the not home front is covered from what it sounds like. It's really, I'm very excited for you. And you've been sharing little teasers, I'm assuming, from the collection of poetry on YouTube videos,
Mm-hmm.
right? You want to talk a little bit about that? I'll share some of that with people too. But
yeah. Well, first, what you're saying about what I was able to include, I mean, one of the things I got to do in the science fiction novel is I have like high policymakers. I'm able to include key characters in conspiracies that prolong the war, but like they're not bad guys. They're just have certain agendas of their own that converge with these things. So yeah, I really do take advantage of the opportunity to say, look, a country goes to war for a bazillion different reasons, and here's the how they all come together for an effect. And here's all the different kinds of places that would need to be addressed if we're ever going to reconcile or move past war. But now the poetry is fun because it's a lot shorter, right? And I'm not much for marketing, but I love to read. I've been able to put my kids asleep easily, from their earliest memories of me. And it's one of my superpowers as a teacher, especially with regards to poetry. You know, I teach an American poetry class, and people will come into class, you know, having done the reading and like not understanding anything, like, oh, and the first thing I do in class is I read it aloud. Then they look at me like slightly annoyed, like, well, when you read it that way, it makes perfect sense. Right. And so, I mean, obviously, poetry is an embodied art. Voice is essential to it. I mean, there are experimental types of poetry where I suppose that's less central, but I'm not writing that. And so I took the opportunity during my terminal leave period from this last deployment to do a series of videos, and I've just had fun, right? Of me on different locations reading poems from the collection. Just, I mean, you could call it marketing, but I really just wanted people to walk away with a poem, right? It's a freebie. So, and I've gotten to go some amazing places. I think the places are as much a character as the voice and the poem. And don't forget the dog. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Those are on YouTube. The channel is Unwound or Unwound, depending on how you want to pronounce that. I do it both ways. And yeah, just Liam Corley Unwound on YouTube. You'll hit all 6 or 7 that I've got up there now. Enjoy.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is a delight, honestly. I really love you walking through the memorial. That was one of my favorites. So yeah, I will make sure we can see those in addition to this interview. So thanks so much for your time. And obviously your contribution to not only the Journal of Veteran Studies, but to literature, to poetry. Like we appreciate your voice. And look forward to reading your new works.
Thank you, Mariana. Well, as my article says, as I well know, and as everybody who knows veteran studies generally, it's people like you who make sure that voices get out there. And so if it weren't for you and your work, both with veterans generally and the Journal of Veteran Studies, our voices would just be in our room like I'm sitting in right now, but thanks to you, I hope more people hear this. So really grateful for you and your long dedication.
Thank you for that.